here.
The isolation is a lie. They are never truly alone. Deep in the rust and silence of Australia's forgotten ruins, 15 nightmares still breathe. Stop scrolling. This is your warning. We dare you to look. The top 15 haunted abandoned places. 1. Airedale Lunatic Asylum, Victoria. The air inside Airedale Lunatic Asylum is famously colder than the surrounding Victorian scrub, thick with the residue of neglect and profound despair. Even the robust stone walls of this sprawling former psychiatric facility seem to sweat misery since its closure. The silence has amplified the unseen activity, transforming the sun-drenched grounds near Ararat into a crucible of residual fear. Visitors often report a crushing pressure, a profound sense of unwelcome that goes beyond mere Gothic architecture and feels undeniably personal. Established in 1867, Airedale housed the criminally insane, the socially undesirable, and those simply too broken for mainstream society. Over its 130-year operational history, it witnessed the deaths of nearly 13 Uru patients and staff, a staggering tally attributed not only to natural causes but also to brutal treatments, endemic overcrowding, and rampant administrative neglect. The infamous J Ward section, originally reserved for maximum security male lunatics, holds the darkest notoriety, a place where extreme restraint and electroshock therapy were standard practice, leaving an undeniable psychic scar on the structure itself. The hauntings are manifold, often localized to specific high-trauma areas. In the female wing, the ghost of Nurse Carey is frequently sighted, a figure in a white uniform who appears only to vanish down the long, empty corridors, her spectral presence accompanied by the faint smell of antiseptic. More terrifying are the manifestations documented in the operating theater and the morgue. Investigators have recorded anomalous electronic voice phenomena, EVP, of agonizing screams and desperate, muffled pleas, impossible to explain away as environmental noise. However, the most consistent presence is the tormented spirit of Old Man Smith, a patient who died violently, whose chilling breath and heavy footsteps are often felt and heard pacing the administrative wing long after midnight. Airedale is not simply haunted, it is saturated by its past. The institutional memory is palpable, a corrosive force that grips anyone lingering after dark. Documentation confirms what local legend suggests. Every cold touch, every whispered threat caught on recording, is a spectral echo of the thousands who entered its gates, seeking help, and who instead found a permanent, restless captivity within its cold, hard stone. 2. Beechworth Lunatic Asylum, Victoria. The sheer scale of Mayday Hills Asylum, perched menacingly above the historic town of Beechworth, is its first weapon against the living. It doesn't merely dominate the landscape, it suffocates it. The Victorian grandeur of its granite facade, built to inspire confidence, is instead a grotesque mask. Over 128 years of institutional suffering, the air inside the abandoned complex is permanently cold, heavy with the dust of forgotten treatments and the residual fear of the thousands who were committed to its isolated grounds. Operational from 1867 until 1995, the asylum housed over 9,000 patients, many diagnosed with conditions as vague as grief or excessive masturbation. The methods employed within the deep wards, from violent hydrotherapy to mechanical restraints, ensured that genuine madness often flourished where it was initially absent. Legend holds that the darkest energies coalesce around the original women's wards and the morgue, places where suffering was silent and absolute, ensuring that the former inhabitants rarely found peace even in death. Visitors and paranormal researchers consistently report auditory phenomena that defy logical explanation. Heavy, dragging sounds resonate from the upper floors when they are demonstrably empty, often accompanied by the chilling sound of keys rattling just out of sight. In the long, deserted hallways of the isolation wings, observers have felt sudden, aggressive physical pressure, as if forcefully repelled by an unseen guard or patient. Most disturbing is the recurring manifestation in the administrative block, the apparition of a matron, stern and pale, who is said to glide across the threshold of the treatment rooms, her phantom keys jingling, a silent, icy chime preceding the sound of a distant, agonizing scream that never quite reaches its climax. Beechworth Lunatic Asylum closed decades ago, but the mechanism of its cruelty remains tragically stuck, running on residual pain and confusion. To walk those echoing halls is not merely to encounter ghosts trapped in the past, but to become an unwilling participant in a century-long, suffocating captivity that the spirits cannot, or will not, leave behind. 3. Monte Cristo Homestead, Junee, New South Wales. The air in Junee, New South Wales, thickens with a pervasive, ancient melancholy as twilight falls over the Monte Cristo homestead. This Victorian manor, perched on a hill, doesn't just hold history, it traps it. An opulent mausoleum where the spirits of the long-deceased Ryan family still perform their silent, endless tragedy. Even before setting foot inside, a chilling pressure descends, a palpable sense that the house resents intrusion, guarding its secrets with spectral vigilance. Built in 1886 by Christopher and Elizabeth Ryan, the homestead became synonymous with prosperity and, inevitably, death. The family's tenure was marred by a grim series of accidents and inexplicable fatalities. A maid tumbled from the balcony. The stable boy burned alive in his sleep. A child was tragically dropped down the stairs by a nanny. These deaths, sudden and violent, are the roots of the haunting, twisting the grand architecture into a vessel of residual, tormented energy. The legend whispers that Christopher Ryan, a man who ruled his domain with iron severity, remains the most formidable presence. Pacing the hallways, eternally surveying his cursed estate, the hauntings are relentless and specific. Visitors frequently report furniture moving unassisted in the drawing room, followed by a profound drop in temperature. In the nursery, where the tragedy of the fallen child occurred, a cold, mournful sigh is often heard, accompanied by the distinct rocking motion of an empty cradle. However, the most chilling manifestation occurs on the landing. The spectral figure of Elizabeth Ryan, dressed in black, staring out of the upper window, a figure of unending grief who watches trespassers with palpable malice. To spend the night within Monte Cristo is to participate in the Ryan family's suffering. The lights flicker, doors slam shut, and the heavy footfalls of the master resonate through the floorboards above. As the sun rises, the atmosphere lifts only slightly, leaving behind the certainty that these souls are not merely trapped, but actively hostile eternal custodians of a house that refuses to acknowledge the peace of the grave. 4. Bungarabee Homestead Site, New South Wales. The foundations of the Bungarabee homestead now rest beneath open sky, a scatter of broken sandstone blocks and dense lantana scrub that betray the site's vast 19th century ambitions. A palpable sense of abandonment lingers, thick as the morning fog that rolls off the surrounding plains. The air here is perpetually cooler than the land nearby, an effect long attributed to the deep, cracked cellar where the main house once stood. Investigators visiting the site consistently report an unnerving acoustic phenomenon. Silence is muffled, and distant traffic sounds become unsettlingly close, often misinterpreted as muffled human activity. Local lore ties this persistent chill to the site's most tragic resident, Eleanor Vance, the young wife of the original estate manager, who perished mysteriously during an isolated diphtheria outbreak in the drought of 1843. Due to the era's urgency and intense fear of contagion, Eleanor was reportedly buried not in consecrated ground, but hastily interred on the property itself, close to the location of the old kitchen wing. The legend asserts that she was laid to rest without the proper rituals, her spirit forever tethered to the crumbling foundations by the injustice of her sudden abandonment and solitary grave. The manifestations at Bungarabie are intensely sensory rather than primarily visual. Visitors often document the sudden, overwhelming scent of decaying lavender and wet linen, particularly when passing near the remaining stone chimney. More disturbing are the auditory events. Recorded EVP sessions have captured faint, sustained whispering that is impossible to translate, interspersed with what sounds distinctly like the slow dragging of heavy fabric across rough stone. Experienced teams note that specialized equipment frequently spikes near the cellar entrance, correlating precisely with significant drops in ambient temperature, a classic signature pattern associated with the passage of the unseen. While the grand house is long gone, the presence is absolute. The ghost of Eleanor Vance does not wander. She waits, bound to the very footprint of the home that failed to protect her in life and in death. Anyone remaining after sundown reports the distinct impression of being watched from the surrounding. Impenetrable darkness a patient. Silent surveillance that reminds trespassers that while time erased the structure, it did not grant release to the unfortunate soul trapped beneath the dust of Bungarabie. Yerenderie, New South Wales. The air over Yerenderie is thin and dusted with fine, residual silver years after the last miner packed his meager belongings. Located deep in the rugged southern highlands of Nest-Rutlands, the journey itself is a gauntlet of winding, desolate track, designed to discourage all but the most dedicated explorer of decay. What remains is a skeletal town frozen in the early 1920s, the era when the silver finally ran out and the population vanished, leaving behind corrugated iron shells and the crushing silence of the wilderness, broken only by the wind whistling through empty window frames. Yerenderie's brief, explosive prosperity saw the hasty construction of hotels and a school, all predicated on the assumption that the loads would never fail. When they did, the despair was immediate and absolute. Local legend focuses intensely on the fate of the mine manager, Mr. O'Connell, who, following the catastrophic collapse of the main shaft, a disaster that trapped 4 men, succumbed to a delirium of guilt. He did not leave with the others. He simply ceased to be visible within the town boundaries, his ledger and spectacles left open on his desk in the assay office, a testament to his unending vigil. Visitors today, particularly those sheltering within the derelict post office store or the main administrative block, report distinct auditory phenomena consistent with the old operations. The rhythmic, maddening clack, clack, clack of an engine running far beneath the earth persists, even though all heavy machinery was stripped decades ago. More disturbingly, O'Connell's presence is reported within the administrative buildings, not as a full apparition, but as a chilling, focused breath close to the ear, often accompanied by the faint, metallic scent of ozone and freshly polished silver, a sensory anchor to his last moments of productivity. The ultimate terror of Yerenderie is the distinct feeling of being surveyed and recorded. If one spends a night in the schoolhouse, sometimes the old chalkboard reveals a tally mark where none was before. Always exactly 5 strokes, 4 miners lost. And the manager who never left. They remain trapped by the failure of the earth and the weight of the silver that turned to leaden sorrow. Maytown, Queensland. The dust of Maytown, Queensland, hangs heavy and unsettling, a fine red silt that seems to absorb the sunlight and radiate only the chill of memory. It is a true ghost town, abandoned to the unforgiving heat and the silent testimony of corrugated iron ruins clinging to the banks of the Palmer River. When the wind picks up, it does not sound like rustling leaves, but the whispered lament of 1,000 broken promises, a ghostly echo from the gold rush era that birthed and then brutally consumed this settlement. Maytown, established in the 1870s, was once the bustling hub of the Hodgkinson goldfield. The history of the area is soaked in violence, greed, and despair. Typhoid outbreaks swept through the populace, miners died from cave-ins, and confrontations with the local indigenous inhabitants were common and deadly. The town's cemetery, now little more than unmarked mounds beneath stubborn scrub, is a testament to the swift, often arbitrary cruelty of life on the frontier. Locals who venture near the ruins today speak not of residual energy, but of active, malevolent entities trapped by their desperate attachment to the cursed earth. The most persistent haunting centers on the remains of the old police barracks. Visitors report inexplicable temperature drops inside the crumbled foundations, accompanied by the distinct, sickening smell of decay, even in the dry heat. More terrifying are the auditory phenomena. The faint but undeniable sound of a tin trunk being dragged across rough floorboards, followed by a sudden, frantic scratching noise. It is believed to be the spirit of Constable James, who reportedly buried his small cache of stolen gold near his bunk before succumbing to fever in 1886. Anyone who lingers after sunset often sees a fleeting dark shadow darting low across the ground, forever guarding a treasure that no longer exists, forever searching for peace that the Maytown soil will not grant. If you stay long enough, watching the rusted relics of the Royal Hotel collapse slowly into the dry scrub, the feeling shifts from historical curiosity to raw dread. The emptiness is not a vacuum, but a suffocating presence. And sometimes, just as the last light fades, a sound cuts through the silence, a desperate, high-pitched laugh, manic and mournful, belonging to one of the forgotten few who found only madness where they sought fortune, condemned now to wander the desolate streets of Maytown forever. Seven, Undaga, Western Australia. The silence of Undaga is not peaceful. It is a heavy, pressurized absence of sound, broken only by the grit-laden wind scouring the iron remnants. 50 kilometers north of Mennies, the skeletal remains of the gold rush settlement bake under the constant Western Australian sun. Everything here is copper-colored. The dust, the rust, and the oppressive feeling of being watched by entities who bitterly resent the living. Prospectors who venture too close to the old lease sites often speak of an overwhelming sense of dread that manifests regardless of the blazing daylight. The region's true darkness is rooted in the 1903 mine collapse at the Brilliant Leases shaft, an event that entombed 8 men alive. Rescue efforts were deemed too dangerous, and some whispered of deliberate sabotage by rival claim holders. Rather than recovery, the bodies were sealed permanently behind a hasty cement cap placed 70 feet below ground. It is said the men, desperate and terrified in the suffocating dark, did not die quickly, and their final, agonizing hours of panic became permanently imprinted upon the deep bedrock surrounding the shaft. Experienced paranormal investigators visiting Undaga consistently report extreme localized anomalies near that capped shaft. Digital recorders routinely capture deep, rattling coughs and muffled, gasping screams seemingly emanating from beneath the earth, often accompanied by a sudden, profound drop in temperature despite the arid heat. The most unsettling testimony involves phantom hammering, a rapid, panicked sound suggesting someone is still desperately trying to break free from the limestone tomb, a desperate attempt persisting decades after their death. These residual echoes are more than just trapped energy. They possess a distinct, corrosive malice. Anyone lingering after twilight claims they feel a cold, insistent tug on their boots, a perverse invitation to join the subterranean chamber. Undaga does not simply hold ruins. It holds graves that are actively resisting the seal placed upon them, their occupants waiting for the ground above to finally give way and release the anguish of their long burial. H. Wycliffe Well, Northern Territory. The silence around Wycliffe Well is not empty. It is a pressurized vacuum, even before the neon sign advertising extraterrestrial kitsch comes into view. The air vibrates with a profound sense of surveillance. The roadhouse, sitting in the heart of the Tanami Desert, acts as a psychic lightning rod, drawing in the lost energy of the vast Northern Territory night. Visitors come searching for flying saucers, hoping to witness advanced craft. But they often leave pursued by something much closer to the ground, something anciently human that has been trapped by the relentless isolation of the outback. The documented sightings of unexplained aerial phenomena began in 1983, yet the disturbances predate this modern curiosity. Long before the term UFO was mainstream, drovers and early prospectors traversing the harsh inland reported shifting lights that didn't move like flares or stars. The local legend among the older residents suggests these lights are not advanced technology, but the desperate, disoriented spirits of men who succumbed to the brutal sun and the confusion of the trackless expanse. One specific tragedy involves a surveyor named Alistair Finch, lost in the 1930s. His search party reported finding his camp untouched, but saw a faint, bobbing light guiding them deeper into the scrub, an illusory beacon that nearly killed the rescuers, luring them further from civilization. The hauntings at the roadhouse itself focus on objects misplaced or suddenly activated, mimicking the panic of the lost. Staff report radios clicking onto static screams late at night, and keys vanishing from locked cabinets only to reappear scattered miles away on the access track. A desperate, futile attempt by the trapped entity to escape the confines of the building and find the main highway. Most unnerving are the acoustic recordings taken near the dry wellhead behind the main compound. These analyses often capture low-frequency moans that sound less like physical suffering and more like bewildered, whispered questioning, echoing through the hot, still air. Where's the track? Or which way is Alice? The prevailing theory is that Wycliffe Wells' famous lights are merely a vast, collective misunderstanding. The desperate attempts of multiple lost souls manifesting as luminous flares, searching for rescue across the desolate plain. When you look up into the endless dark sky here, the true horror isn't the possibility of beings from other worlds. It is the realization that some people, utterly alone in the desert, never truly left this one. Their frantic, fading essence now mistaken for cosmic wonder. 9. Port Arthur, Tasmania. The green lawns and picturesque ruins of Port Arthur on the Tasman Peninsula are a profound, beautiful deception. This former penal colony was not merely a prison. It was a psychological experiment designed to break the spirit. A dark engine fueled by starvation, torture, and systematic isolation. The spectral architecture remains, but the true ruins are the unseen scars on the air itself. Soaked with the pervasive despair of 10,000 broken men, the silence here is not peaceful. It is heavy, dense, and perpetually listening. Port Arthur is arguably the most haunted location in Australia, saturated by the energy of those who died without dignity or repentance. The systematic horrors committed here ensured its permanence as an intense paranormal hotspot. The Dead House, where the deceased were held before burial on the Isle of the Dead, is frequently reported to carry the immediate stench of decay and cold. Oppressive air pockets even during high summer, security staff and night watchmen, initially skeptical, soon learn the undeniable truth that the dead here are not resting. The unforgiving stone and the shallow graves act as anchors for the tormented energies, eternally tethering them to the site of their suffering. Specific manifestations center heavily around the separate prison, designed for total sensory deprivation, and the vast, hollow shell of the penitentiary. Visitors frequently report the chilling sensation of being physically touched or shoved by invisible hands, particularly in narrow passageways. They hear the distinct, wet sound of heavy boots dragging across cobblestones where no living person stands, often followed by the clinking of non-existent chains. Most disturbing is the recurrence of pale, shadowy figures seen lurking at the edges of the ruined hospital apparitions, exhibiting severe distress or injury, caught in a loop of their final agony. One documented account details a security guard locking down the grounds near the commandant's house, only to hear the faint, echoing sound of a man screaming for a mercy that was never granted, followed by a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature that froze the internal camera system. Port Arthur does not merely contain the past, it actively bleeds it into the present. The chains may be gone, but the tormented spirits remain eternally locked within their open-air cage. Old Melbourne Jail, Victoria. The massive bluestone walls of the Old Melbourne Jail hold a specific, suffocating kind of cold, a chill that has nothing to do with the outside air. Between 1842 and 1929, this grim structure witnessed the slow decay and ultimate demise of some of Victoria's most infamous figures. Culminating in over 130 executions, the architecture was engineered not just to contain the condemned, but seemingly to trap their suffering within the thick masonry. Visitors often report a crushing dread upon entering the narrow, dark corridors, an inescapable feeling of being watched by the silent witnesses of past brutality. The history of the jail is one of relentless oppression and summary justice, where life inside was brief and often ended abruptly by the rope. Though the body count includes notorious figures like Ned Kelly, the residual psychic energy is often attributed to those forgotten victims, men and women whose final moments were marked by absolute terror on the scaffold. The area near the former execution block is particularly charged, a documented epicenter of paranormal activity where temperatures can drop by 20 degrees instantly, and the air thickens with an inexplicable, breathless heaviness. One of the most persistent spectral residents is the ghost of Martha Needle, a known poisoner of her own family, executed in 1894. Sightings often place her near the courtyard, a distinct figure in black moving quickly before dissolving into the shadows. More disturbing are the auditory phenomena, high, frantic weeping echoing from empty cells, sounds that cease immediately if approached. Others have felt the distinct pressure of unseen hands pressing them against the walls, or the icy graze of a touch on the neck, a sensation many attribute directly to the vengeful spirit's denied peace. To walk these halls is not merely to visit a museum of penal history. It is to intrude upon an active tomb. The cold here is a conscious thing, a manifestation of trapped grief and fear. When the heavy doors clank shut behind the last tour group, the jail does not sleep. It simply waits, holding the echoes of the final screams and the memory of the sharp, terminal drop, forever preserved within the cold blue stone. Walhalla, Victoria. The deep, shadowed valley that cradles Walhalla is a natural mausoleum, perpetually damp and cloaked in mountain mist. Once the site of staggering wealth extracted from the long tunnel extended mine, the town flourished briefly, its isolation mirroring its feverish desperation. When the gold ran dry, the lifeblood drained out, leaving behind perfectly preserved Victorian structures and a heavy sense of waiting. It is a town built on extracted life, and those lives seem relentlessly unwilling to move on. Walhalla is not merely preserved history, it is an environment saturated with the kinetic memory of sudden fortune and widespread, crushing failure. The prevalent hauntings are less about singular, dramatic apparitions and more about the residue of intense, agonizing labor. Visitors and long-term caretakers report persistent, rhythmic sounds emanating from the deep shafts, the phantom scrape of pickaxes echoing far beneath the surface. Especially near the old crushing battery, these aren't random noises, but the sound of work that can never truly finish. More disturbingly, the narrow lanes near the historic Mechanics Institute often carry the sudden, sharp smell of stale, damp powder smoke a scent that inexplicably precedes drastic drops in air temperature, as if the oxygen is being momentarily consumed by a spectral blast. The most concentrated paranormal energy is often cataloged within the walls of the reconstructed Star Hotel, where guests have repeatedly documented the unnerving sound of heavy boots pacing empty upper hallways late at night, often accompanied by the quiet murmur of arguments over claims that stopped decades ago. It is understood that the miners, having died without fulfilling their fortunes, are trapped in an endless shift, eternally counting what they lost. Up on the steep hillside cemetery, where headstones tilt precariously in the loam, shadows frequently detach themselves from the iron lacework of the surrounding fence just before dawn. Walhalla remains occupied by the fierce echoes of a desperate past, confirming that sometimes the richest veins are those of human despair, eternally worked by the dead. Tweedle, Big Bell, Western Australia. The silence at Big Bell is a heavy, metallic thing weighted by the iron oxide dust that coats the foundations. 70 kilometers west of Kew, the temperature remains merciless. Even at dusk, what remains of the once booming 1930s settlement is skeletal. Concrete slabs baking under the Western Australian sun. Surrounded by mulga scrub, the air carries the scent of dry earth and something faintly sulfurous, a residue of the vast mine operation that vanished decades ago, leaving behind only the heat and a profound sense of abandonment. Big Bell was the site of immense promise and equally immense failure, though 276 usury ounces of gold were extracted. The life was brutal. The men who toiled deep beneath the surface faced oppressive heat, inadequate safety, and the constant threat of collapse and inundation. Local accounts logged during the 1960s cleanup suggest that those who died notably victims of a shaft flooding in 41 never truly left the lease. Their restless presence is said to be intrinsically tied to the very machinery that failed them, specifically the huge, clanging shift bell that once summoned them back to the dangerous pit. Documented anomalies consistently reference kinetic movement near the main generator block, a massive concrete square where the hoisting mechanism once stood. Equipment, long since dismantled and sold for scrap, has reportedly been heard grinding or rattling in the middle of the night by passing prospectors attempting to shelter there. More chilling, however, is the auditory evidence collected by modern paranormal survey teams. Recordings taken near the old barracks ruins captured faint, hurried breathing and, intermittently, a distorted, deep metallic sound, a loud, singular clang that seems to originate from underground, precisely where the main shaft was sealed decades ago. Researchers posit this sound is the lingering kinetic echo of the massive mine bell, ringing once, signaling a shift that ended abruptly and violently. It is not an alarm for the living, but a summons for the dead. Anyone spending a full night on the lease reports waking abruptly just before dawn to an absolute, paralyzing stillness, often accompanied by the feeling of being intensely scrutinized by a dozen desperate, unseen eyes, still waiting for the shift whistle to blow them out of the suffocating dark. Cockatoo Island, New South Wales. Cockatoo Island, moored in the steel-gray waters of Sydney Harbour, does not feel like a tourist destination, and it is a palimpsest of misery, its sandstone walls exuding the damp chill of confined suffering. Even under the fierce Australian sun, the wind whistling through the vast, abandoned dockyards carries not the scent of salt water, but something metallic and stale, the ghost of industry overlaid with older, more primal pain. Rooted in the bedrock of convict history, the island's dark legacy began in 1839 as a maximum security penal colony, a hellhole built by the inmates themselves. Men were chained deep within subterranean silos used for grain storage, enduring conditions of absolute deprivation and perpetual darkness. The island later transitioned into an industrial school for girls and then a massive naval shipyard. But the foundational trauma of the convict era remains the dominant specter. The legend persists that during the construction of the Fitzroy Dock, an unnamed man was crushed and his remains sealed within the fresh concrete foundation, ensuring his eternal bondage to the island. Witness accounts across the decades focus on the solitary confinement cells and the dank tunnels beneath B Ward. Security staff frequently report an unnerving pressure drop in specific, enclosed areas, always accompanied by the distinct sound of scraping metal, the phantom echo of leg irons being dragged across rough-hewn stone. Visitors often describe a sudden, suffocating coldness in the dry dock itself, followed by the pungent smell of old sweat, rust, and fear, though no source of the odor can ever be located. Most chilling are the disembodied, ragged coughs heard echoing from the abandoned grain silos, sounding utterly starved of air and hope, seemingly trapped by the density of the surrounding earth. When the last ferry leaves and the harbor lights dim, the air thickens with this unspoken history. The island's vast, rusting machinery waits, a silent monument to human labor and systemic cruelty. Those few caretakers who remain overnight often wake to the certain, dreadful knowledge that they are not alone, surrounded by the invisible population that never received their pardon and can never leave the sandstone walls. Freen, Rottnest Island, Western Australia. The pristine beaches of Wajamup, or Rottnest Island, deceive the casual tourist. By day, the sunlight burns away shadows, but as twilight extinguishes the vibrant blue and throws the limestone into sharp relief, the island's true history asserts itself. This seemingly idyllic sanctuary masks a profound spiritual unrest, rooted in the suffering inflicted during its era as a penal colony. The energy here is heavy, a chilling contrast to the holiday atmosphere, asserting that the island belongs not to the living, but to the thousands who died here. From 1838 until 1931, the island functioned primarily as an Aboriginal institution, a place of isolation and systemic cruelty for Indigenous men from across Western Australia. Disease typhus, dysentery, measles swept through the crowded, unsanitary cells of the quad barracks with terrifying regularity. Official records indicate hundreds of deaths during this period, though the true number is speculated to be far higher, with the deceased interred in unmarked or mass graves. This documented injustice, built upon human suffering and disrespect, fuels the island's continuous spectral activity. The residual energy is most palpable within the surviving infrastructure of the Quadi, now ironically repurposed as tourist accommodation. Caretakers report extreme temperature drops in locked wings, inexplicable echoing coughs, and the distinct, dragging sound of chains across concrete floors. In the immediate vicinity of the former prison burial ground, visitors often experience an overwhelming sensation of localized pressure on the chest, often accompanied by the fleeting, guttural sound of deep, collective lamentation, a sound too ancient and sorrowful to be merely the wind off the ocean. Today, tourists sleep where the prisoners died, often oblivious to the constant spiritual oversight. When the last ferry departs and the island retreats into utter darkness, the spirits of the forgotten men patrol their former confinement. They remain rooted here, silent witnesses to their tragedy, ensuring that the beautiful coastline of Rottnest Island never truly forgets the suffering buried beneath its pale sand. Altona Homestead, Victoria. The damp, coastal chill of suburban Victoria clings to Altona Homestead, a stately limestone relic built in 1842. Its gables stand stark against the modern sprawl, a preserved island where the air pressure feels perpetually heavier, trapping echoes of a past both dignified and desolate. Visitors often comment on the pervasive smell of lavender and old dust, but beneath those pleasantries lies the undeniable sense of being watched by eyes that predate the establishment of the Commonwealth. This lingering sorrow stems chiefly from the legend of Mrs. Sarah Langhorne, wife of the original owner. While the historical record suggests a life of quiet colonial hardship, local lore paints a more tragic portrait. A woman of fragile nerves confined to the sprawling property, suffering an unrecorded affliction that led to deep melancholy and, eventually, a sudden, unexplained passing within the house's cold walls. It is her spectral presence, they say, that keeps the homestead from being just a museum piece, imbuing it instead with a profound, almost hostile melancholy. The manifestations of her distress are specific and unnerving. Witnesses, including caretakers and historical society members, report the distinct sound of a woman weeping, muffled but clearly emanating from the upstairs parlor, a room notably kept locked to the public. More physically jarring are the interactions in the downstairs servants' quarters. Objects move with an aggressive velocity, crockery sliding off shelves, doors slamming shut with impossible force. Particularly when discussions turn to the Langhorne family's early life, guests have described the sensation of icy fingers trailing down their necks while examining the antique portraits, followed by a sudden, irrational spike of panic. Yet the most chilling occurrence centers around the grandfather clock in the main hall. Often, despite being unmaintained and having its weights removed, the mechanism will wind itself. And precisely at 3:15 a.m., the rumored time of Sarah's death, it begins to chime. The tolling is agonizingly slow, metallic and distorted, counting out the fatal hour in the otherwise silent darkness, confirming that the homestead is not merely haunted, but actively governed by the despair of its first mistress. That wraps our countdown of Australia's top 15 haunted abandoned places. From forgotten asylums to ghostly ports, these sites stand as chilling testaments to our past. If we missed your favorite spectral spot, let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the dark side. Until then, stay safe and keep looking over your shoulder.